The Barbie movie is a glorious romp through pinkness. The sets are amazing, the script is funny, and the acting is superb. Apparently, they used so much pink that it caused a worldwide pigment shortage. But what about the costumes? Hello, and welcome to a millinery hat making video. My name is Ilona, I'm a milliner based in London, and in today's video I will be making this pink gingham hat that stereotypical Barbie wears as part of her perfect day outfit. I'll guide you through the entire sewn hat making process, from taking the measurements to fitting and of course all the sewing. I'll even give you some ideas for variations that you can do to change up this style of hat to suit your personality. So click that like button, subscribe to my channel, don't forget to turn on the notification bell, and let's jump into this. First up, you'll need my perfect day picture hat pattern. You can find it on my website and I will leave a link to that in the description box. This hat design features a 6-piece fitted crown and a wide picture hat style brim. The pattern comes in 3 sizes with the full list of materials and notions needed to complete this project. Of course, all my patterns are free to access for all my wonderful Patreons, so if you would like to support my work further, you can sign up using the link in the description box. For your materials, you will need 100% cotton small check gingham for the top fashion fabric, 100% cotton canvas for the crown structural interlining fabric, more 100% cotton gingham, this time in a larger check for the lining and under brim, and cotton organdy fabric for the brim structural interfacing. For more information on what cotton organdy fabric is, check out my video on this subject, which I have linked to in the top right. For your notions, you will need cotton Petersham ribbon for the inner hat band. Please note, this is different to polyester or nylon grosgrain. Synthetics lack the flexible qualities needed for hat making and are not a suitable substitute. A 1.5 cm button for the top decoration. Some plastic brim reed with the corresponding ferrule for the closure. Sometimes this is known as plastic wire, but it's not actually wire because it doesn't bend. We will use this to tension the brim for that perfect flop. Some Yoo-hoo glue to fix the ferrule wire closure in place. And finally, a quilting guide for your sewing machine is very useful, but not absolutely essential. To print the pattern, open the file in your PDF viewer program. I use Foxit PDF Reader on Windows 11. Click the print button. This will open up the printer dialog box. Make sure the scale is set to 100% and the correct paper size is selected. A4 for European printers or letter for US printers. When printed, check the size of the 2.5 cm or 2-inch square. It should be exactly correct. To stick the pattern together, cut along this red line and then line up that cut edge to the blue perforated line on the other page. Use tape to secure it in place. For this hat, you're going to need 2 measurements. That's your head circumference and your ear to ear measurement. Let me show you how to take those. First, the head circumference. Take your tape measure and wrap it around your head. Don't hold it too tight and don't let it be too loose. It should go just above the tip of your ear and meet just above your eyebrows, and take the reading where the tape measure meets. You'll notice that I've got my hair up in a bun and the tape measure is wrapped around the bulk of the bun. If you prefer to wear your hair in a bun or up, it's always best to take measurements taking into account that extra bulk. Bigger is always better than smaller, as you can always take away from the pattern later on in the mock-up. And now for the side-to-side measurement, also known as the ear-to-ear. Find the tip of your ear on one side of your head and then very loosely pass that tape measure straight across the top to the tip of the other ear and take that measurement. Now, I always find it helpful to add a couple of centimeters to that just to lengthen the crown a bit, giving it a bit more height so that you have some space to play with. You can always shorten it in your mock-up later on. It's always easier to take away from pattern pieces than to add to them once you've cut them out of your fabric. Now that you have your measurements, double check these on the flat pattern for the crown. Measure the distance between the orange seam lines. It should be equal to half your ear-to-ear measurement plus 1 centimeter. If it's not, add or subtract the length as needed from the very base of the pattern piece. Don't forget to draw in a new seam line. Next, I'm going to make the lining part of the crown and use this as a mock-up to check the fit. Place the pattern pieces onto your lining fabric. Make sure the pattern pieces are placed on the bias. This is really important for all millinery. I have a video about the bias in millinery, which I will link to in the top right. You need 6 pieces for the crown. If you want to be super advanced, try matching the checks on the gingham fabric, but this isn't strictly necessary. To keep track of pattern pieces, it can be helpful to number them using a friction pen inside the seam lines. These marks should come off with the application of heat later from an iron. Sew the pattern pieces in pairs, 1 to 2, 3 to 4, and 5 to 6. When you sew, sew up to, but not through, the top point seam line. Sew 2 to 3 and 5 to 4. And now the final seam of 1 to 6. Look here at how my top point looks. You may find that you have a hole in the very top tip. This is exactly what you want. This will be solved later at the very end. Now that it is all sewed, the seams need to be pressed. This step can be tricky, but don't be tempted to skip it. You can use either a tailor's ham or a poupée head if you have one. Pressing on a tailor's ham requires a lot of manoeuvring, but it is possible. However, I think it is much easier on a poupée head, which is essentially a cork wig stand. If you plan to make a lot of hats, I highly recommend buying one of these as it can make tasks like this a lot easier. When pressing the central point, fold each part of the seam to the left. When you have pressed all the seams, you will see the hole at the top tip of the hat that I mentioned earlier. This is the lining, which for all intents and purposes I am using as a mock-up at the same time to save some fabric. And yes, I know it looks a little bit ridiculous and like I'm wearing a very silly swimming cap, but the finished hat will look better, I promise. So in terms of fitting, I'm looking to see if the depth in the crown is enough, so it's not too loose and it's not too tight. And I think it's definitely just right. So I have to take into account that there'll be a seam about here. The seams are 1.5 centimeters. So actually, I don't think I need to change anything about this cap, but that might not be the case for you. You might need to extend the length if you find the cap is sitting too tight, or you might need to shorten it if you find that it's coming all the way over your head like this, because this hat is going to sit a little bit further back. But in terms for me, I think this is great and I'll move on to the next step. Once you are happy with your fit, stitch the seams flat. This will keep them nicely pressed on the inside of the hat. Place your stitch about 3 to 5 millimeters either side of each seam. Stitch across the whole length of the crown, passing through the central top tip ear to ear each time. Cut out 6 pieces from your cotton canvas interlining fabric and 6 pieces from your top fashion fabric. Once again, all the pattern pieces are placed on the bias. Flatline the fashion fabric pieces with the cotton canvas. All this means is join together each cotton canvas piece with each fashion fabric piece by running a long basting stitch on the inside of each seam. And now stitch the interfaced fashion fabric pieces together just like we did with the lining. 1 to 2, 3 to 4, 5 to 6. Then 2 to 3 and 4 to 5, and finally 1 to 6. Don't forget to press all these sewn seams open, just like we did when making the lining. This next step is what will give your hat that professional finish, reinforcing the seams. I am passing a row of stitches 3 to 5 millimeters either side of the patterned seam. As you stitch, pull the pieces of the crown apart. These extra rows of stitches will give the hat some more structure and will fix the seam allowance flat. You may have to change your needle to a larger size to get through all the layers of fabric. Have you ever wondered why sewn hats have a button or a pom-pom or something at the top of the crown? Well, it's because of that hole where all the points of the 6 sections meet. To make a central button in the same fashion fabric as the rest of the hat, cut out a 4 cm circle in the fashion fabric and in the cotton canvas interlining fabric. Draw on the 3 cm stitching line using a friction pen. Place a plain 15 mm button into the center and tack it down in place. Run a gathering stitch using a double-threaded needle along the 3 cm circle line. Pull the thread tight. Put some extra stitches in place to keep the fabric gathered. Once you are happy that it won't unravel, tie off the thread and unpick the tacking stitches from the center. Now you can sew this to the top of the crown. Now it's time for the brim. Fold your fabric into a triangle with 2 folds. You will have one edge where you can see the 2 folds and one edge where you can only see a single fold. I have mine folded on the bias, that's why it forms a triangle. I have found that if you cut the brim on the straight grain, it will look like you've draped a tablecloth over your lovely hat, so best to cut it on the bias. Place the cotton organdy interfacing onto the wrong side of your brim underside fabric. Then place your brim fashion fabric right side down onto the right side of your brim underside fabric. Sew along the brim edge seam. Trim the seam allowance down to about 5 millimeters. Turn the whole brim inside out and press. Using something flat like a ruler can be really useful to push the seam out and get a really crisp edge. Sew a 5 millimeter channel for the brim reed. Leave at least a 10 centimeter gap at the back so that you can insert the brim reed in the next step. Pass the brim reed through the sewn channel. You need to give it a good tension, which means you need to push through more brim reed than the actual circumference of the brim. See how now that I have pushed it through, it is standing up in places off the table and flopping around. This is exactly how you want it. Cut the excess off the ends, but make sure you leave about 15 centimeters on each end. Turn the brim back inside out and fix the ferrule to one end of the brim reed using Yoo-hoo glue and pliers. To close the brim reed with the correct tension, it would be best to turn the hat back to being the correct way out. However, I have filmed closing the brim reed to the ferrule without this so that you can see the closure on camera. Now press the brim again to make all the fabric nice and flat and the edge seams crisp. Don't forget to close the 10 centimeter gap in the channel. Next, we will need to quilt the brim. Place rows of stitching 1.5 centimeters apart. This is where having the quilting guide comes in handy. Press the hat flat after every 2 rows of stitches. This ensures that the fabric stays tight and doesn't bunch up and crease between all the rows. Double check where the head size line is using the brim pattern piece. I have passed a basting stitch in red thread so that you can see it. I have also done the same on the crown. Join the top side of the brim to the outside of the crown using pins. For this hat, I am placing a seam of the crown centrally to the front and back of the brim. But you can choose to place the front of the brim centrally to a crown pattern piece if you don't want to see a seam from the front. Find the central point of the side of the crown and align that to the side of the brim. Distribute the rest of the crown into the remaining brim. If you feel confident, take this straight to the sewing machine, or you can choose to baste it together and then take it to the sewing machine. I find it easier to remove the extension table and sew the brim to the crown as if it was a sleeve in an armhole. Pass 2 rows of stitching, one directly on your head size line and one a few millimeters inside it. Cut the cotton Petersham ribbon to your head size plus 3 centimeters for a seam allowance. Divide your head size into 6 and mark these lengths onto the ribbon using pins. Don't forget to omit the seam allowance for these markings. I find it easier to start in the center and work outwards. Pin the Petersham ribbon to the head fitting. Match your pins to the seams in the crown. At the center back, fold the seam allowance under to hide the cut edges. Sew it in place on the sewing machine. Technically, you shouldn't sew things with perpendicular pins on them, but I won't tell anyone if you don't. For the trim, make a piece of 25mm bias binding. You can use a handy bias binding maker or make it the old-fashioned way by hand. You won't need more than 60 centimeters of it, so it's not too tedious. Top stitch it to the crown of the hat, making sure to keep the head-fitting Petersham ribbon out of the way. I am placing 1 row of stitches 5mm from the base of the hat, and then another row 5mm from the top edge of the bias binding. The very last step is to sew in the lining. You may find that you need to trim a bit of the edge to make it fit well. Use whip stitches to secure it to the raw edge of the crown to brim join. The Petersham ribbon will cover these raw edges once you are done, and as all the pattern pieces were cut on the bias, there will be no fraying. Put some extra tacking stitches at the very top of the crown to secure the lining fully in place. And here is the finished hat. I think it is such a fun design. The large floppy brim brings some classic picture hat glamour, while the use of the differently sized gingham checks is a playful touch. I know a lot of people have fallen in love with this hat style from the release of the Barbie trailer, and to see it in the film was absolutely fabulous. I can't wait to wear my version of it to the beach when I go on holiday, and I might even make a matching playsuit just like in the film. But what about the variations? I don't want you to think of this hat as just a recreation of Barbie's costume. You can use this same pattern to make a myriad of different designs to suit your needs. You can make this hat out of virtually any fabric. Try it in a silk dupion if you are looking for some shine, or use a printed cotton. I recommend trying this in some gorgeous fabrics from Liberties. You can pick a pattern for the underside of the brim and the lining and choose a coordinating plain solid for the top and the side. You can vary the shape of this hat, make the brim even wider, but you'll need to buy 1 meter of fabric to fit this one. Or just shorten the brim. You can even create a variable brim by shortening just the back and keeping the front wide. Or get rid of the back of the brim completely and turn it into a visor to make a baseball cap. As for trims, you can add a tulle pom-pom instead of the button, or use a fancy ribbon for the decorative band. Trim it with some silk flowers or a giant bow. I hope you've enjoyed this video making the Sewn Perfect Day picture hat with me. Remember, you can download this pattern from the link in the description box, or check out my Patreon where you will find additional millinery resources. You can find me on all the socials listed here and sign up to my newsletter all about hats right up here. Thank you so much for watching, liking and subscribing. See you next time. Bye.